Morning and welcome back to the show. Sorry, I just had to hit my microphone button there because I was just having a chat off air with my next guest, Harold Hillman, executive coach, leadership expert, author as well, joining me in the studio. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Mel.
Hey, it's nice to see you in person because usually we've done this on the phone.
That's right. Makes a big difference. It's a pleasure to meet you in person.
Nice to actually see your face, put a face to the name, so to speak. So today we are going to be talking a little bit about unconscious bias and what it is all about. Many companies are actually requiring this unconscious bias training for their managers and supervisors, aren't they?
That's right. That's right. When we talk about unconscious bias or conscious bias, it's usually within the context of trying to create a diverse workforce where people of all ilks have an equal shot at being hired, being rewarded, being promoted. And in the first 3-4 decades of our focus on diversity, we focused more on conscious bias. I use the analogy of the tip of the iceberg, the proverbial iceberg in the middle of the ocean. At the tip of the iceberg are what we would consider to be conscious biases. And that is, even though a company may say that it's wrong to discriminate against someone, you personally in your own mind know that you would prefer not to work with a person of a certain gender, race, religion, ethnicity. I served as a closeted gay officer in the U.S. military at a time when it was illegal to be gay in the military. So that was a conscious bias where an organization said, we will not have this type of person in the organization. Thank God we have evolved significantly since those days. That's conscious at the tip of the iceberg. At the base of the iceberg, we call those unconscious biases, where they may actually influence how you make decisions, but you're not aware of them because they aren't in your immediate conscious. And so sometimes we infer based on the behaviors that we see what a person's unconscious biases may be.
And this is also when, in the olden days, you would always send a photo in with your CV.
That's
when you're
right.
applying for a job, whereas now that's not required as such. I guess also because you could be looking, or whoever's employing you could be looking at going, oh yeah, she looks like she'd be fun or she'd fit into the office.
That's right.
And unconsciously somebody else might not fit into that, how you perceive your workplace to be.
That's right. And so in some organizations now, they've gone through the practice of removing photos, and for that matter, in some cases, removing names, particularly when they require applicants to submit a sample of what they might do in a scenario, which tends to absolutely level the playing field, whereas unconscious biases may sway you one way or the other.
Age as well. People putting a date of birth into a CV, that's stopped as well because...
That's right. My brother experienced that, Mel. He, into his 60s, he worked in IT. And was nearly 70 when he retired. And inside the organization, they knew him, so they knew that he was capable. But he was always amazed at the reaction that he would get from people, old and young folks, who would go, "You work in IT? Aren't you in your 60s?" So the inference being that
you're old, you can't know technology.
Or a high potential young manager, let's say in their early 30s, who are really, on the fast track. And then they become the manager of a team where there are people 15, 20 years their elder. And the unconscious bias being, what can I possibly learn from a young person?
So what is, unconscious bias, are they a bad thing or are they just a human thing?
They're a human thing. They really are. It's how the mind works in terms of the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. So you can't eradicate unconscious biases. It's just a function of being human. But some have a positive valence and some have a negative valence. And so it's important for you, the person, to be mindful of whether or not your unconscious bias may actually be getting in your way. For example, if you're a male leader and 30% of your team is female, and yet the last 4 people to give their resignation are also women, that might be cause for you to take a good look in the mirror and ask yourself if the women on your team are having a different experience than the men.
Well, there's all sorts of investigations too going on to the place where I work right now about all sorts of scenarios like that. For positive bias, what would be a position of unconscious bias where it's actually positive?
There's a common scenario. It may not be the case in New Zealand, but in the States, I think that a lot of Asian people sometimes, wonder whether or not people have put them in a box with regard to being more intelligent than others. In recruitment and hiring, there's an inference very often that Asians are more intelligent. Of course, when we roll out the data, there's probably little difference across all the races, but that would be an example there. In terms of positive bias, very often we believe that women, because women are more self-aware and tend to have higher EQ, there's a tendency often to see them in roles that are around care or giving and those types of things. So an unconscious bias may actually then slip into it's not a conscious bias, because we wouldn't say that men aren't eligible, for example, in roles in HR, but there are a disproportionately higher number of women in HR roles compared to men.
So how can we overcome unconscious biases then? What do we need to do?
Part of it is just being aware of it. Position it not as diversity and inclusion training. Position this with your teams as needing to improve the quality of decision making, and teach everyone to recognize that these are just human. This is the way humans operate, and the way that you can, as a team, get better at this is to every now and then, number one, give each other permission to say, hey, might that be an unconscious bias that you have right there? Make it normalized so it's not necessarily pointing fingers or suggesting that someone has ill intent, but that if we're going to make the best decisions about who we hire, who we reward, who we promote, all related to keeping all employees engaged, it's really good to make it a part of conversation. There should be consequences, which is the other thing around it. And so as a supervisor or as a manager or a leader, having conversations with people who may not be aware that there are certain patterns that have unfolded.
Okay, so those would be the most important things?
That's right. It does help also, Mel, to have a relatively diverse management team or, executive team. There's this old adage that you can't be what you can't see. And so, that resonates in the sense that if you really are trying to create diverse thinking in the organization, it helps to actually have a diverse population at the leadership table.
Makes sense. Harold Hillman, thank you so much for joining us today. Executive coach. Now, if people want to find out more about you, what's the best way to contact you or have a look at what you do?
At www.sigmoidcurve.com.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you so much.